Coney Island attracts 5 million visitors a year. It's one of the most renowned amusement parks in the United States, and possibly the world. But how did that come to be, and why isn't it an island anymore? And most importantly, how did political corruption almost lead to its downfall? Well, stay tuned, because today we discover America's original amusement park, Coney Island. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start our story at a time when European settlers first colonized the land that became Coney Island in 1639. Just 6 years later, the island was purchased from the Native Americans, and from there it passed from owner to owner before ending up under the jurisdiction of New York State. Still, because of its relatively isolated nature, even while New York grew, development on the island itself was stagnant until the 1930s. For most of the time, the island was nothing more than a few farmhouses, pastures, but eventually, from 1830 to 1864, new roads, ferries, and railroads gained access to the island for the upper and middle classes, and this is where rapid development began. By the 1860s, good hotels and boarding houses started to appear on the island as the elite of New York came to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. There were no attractions in the way we see them today. Instead, dance halls, aquariums, and bathhouses were divided into several different parks. However, they weren't quite parks yet. They were more like gated neighborhoods, or maybe just shopping centers, where most of the wealthy or middle class were coming to escape the summer heat, given that the island winds were so strong that the temperatures weren't nearly so bad. But what about the rides? Well, the first ride appeared in 1876, and that was just a wooden carved carousel, but it did signify a change as the island became much more exciting. Zoos joined the aquariums, music was played in the clubs and on the streets, and fireworks shows became more and more common. Shortly after, in 1884, Coney Island's first roller coaster was built. The Switchback roller coaster became a signature attraction. Soon after it was built, a new one-of-a-kind hotel, the Elephant Colossal, was created. The 7-story elephant-shaped amusement center was so tall that it was frequently the first landmark that immigrants saw in the city. As unique as the building was, including a brothel and rooms specifically built to contort to the shape of the elephant's body, it was never financially successful and ended up catching fire and being destroyed in 1896. And yes, you did hear me correctly when you heard me mention a brothel in an elephant-shaped hotel. Back then, Coney Island was far from a family-friendly amusement park. It had all kinds of attractions that were taboo, including saloons, brothels, horse racing, or other gambling parlors. The actual division of land that it was standing upon was not immune to this either. At the time, one of the most dominant members of the Coney Island's extremely autonomous government and the commissioner of the Common Lands was the quite infamous John Y. McKane. McKane was a carpenter by trade when he was young, but later started his own contracting company. He also became a constable and eventually took the seat of commissioner, and this is where things became complicated. But before I explain why, we have to discuss just how complicated life can be without a good life insurance policy. Seeing how these great cities fall makes me realize that it's important to set up a safety net and be prepared for worst-case scenarios. On a personal level, I'd hate to think of the struggles my own family would face if something happened to me, and that's why it's important to have life insurance. Thanks to our sponsor, Policy Genius, this is an easy issue to solve. You see, Policy Genius was built to modernize the life insurance industry. Their technology makes it easy to compare life insurance quotes from America's top insurers in just a few clicks to find your lowest price. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $25 per month for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer coverage in as little as a week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Their licensed agents work for you, not the insurance companies. That means they don't have an incentive to recommend one insurer over another, so you can trust their guidance. Policy Genius is for parents, caregivers, and anyone else who has people who depend on them. They simplify the process of getting life insurance so you can protect the people you love. There are no added fees, and your personal details are private. so it's no wonder they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net. You deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. So head to policygenius.com/itshistory or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. Coney Island and Gravesend had a bizarre leasing and subleasing practice, even by the standards of the time, and McKane took full advantage of it. Basically, parcels on Coney Hook might only go for slightly over $25, but McKane's habits of leasing them to his friends and colleagues meant they often subleased for thousands of dollars. And as you might imagine, most hotels, boarding houses, and businesses on these plots were built by hiring McKane's company. Some speculate that a large number of property fires on the island might have also been in the interest of once again hiring that same company to replace the destroyed property. Still, I'll leave that to your imagination. McKane's power grew. He eventually became the supervisor of Gravesend, commissioner of the tax department, commissioner of licenses, commissioner of water and gas, commissioner of public health, and chair of the local Republican Party. However, that didn't stop him and Tammany Hall from teaming up to play an incredibly instrumental role in getting Democrat President Cleveland elected. Look that up if you want, it's pretty wild. I could go on and on about McKane. He's a pretty wild character, but I think you get the gist of it. So let's just fast forward to the part where the Brooklyn Combined Government caught McKane for influencing the 1893 New York state elections through voter intimidation and ballot stuffing. McKane picked a lousy fight, including having his police club the Brooklyn officials on the eve of the election and falsely imprisoning them until after. He got 6 years in Sing Sing for these crimes, but got out after 4 for good behavior. From there, he returned to his business on Coney Island until his fatal stroke in 1899. Incidentally, the end of his life marked the beginning of Coney Island as the global capital of roller coasters. Following the death of McKane and under the reign of one of his deputies, Kenny Sutherland, the first actual parks were built. Sea Lion Park would change the island's landscape forever. Its creator was Captain Paul Boyton, a man who most recall as being rather absurd. He was known back then as, quote, the fearless Frogman. He gained this title for his series of water stunts performed in the semi-inflatable rubber suit he laid in and paddled down rivers, across lakes, and eventually, in a historic first, the English Channel. The list goes on. Those might not even be his most incredible accomplishments, as he first showed off the suit by jumping off a ship headed from New York to Ireland. The crew tacitly agreed because the weather wasn't dangerous, but to the horror of everyone watching, a storm materialized over his drifting stunt as soon as he jumped off. He was as shocked by his survival as the stunned Irishmen who saw him wash up and stagger into their small town. He proved it worked, and he probably also proved that Americans are quite unique. Anyhow, his fame as the Frogman is what earned him the reputation and capital to open what is often considered the first amusement park in Coney Island. It was known as Paul Boyton's Water Chutes and had many of the same slides and machines you would see at modern small amusement parks. The following year, in 1895, he built Sea Lion Park on Coney Island, featuring many of the same water slides seen in his Chicago, London, and Antwerp parks, but included many other attractions. For example, the park also featured a large artificial lake on which water shows and sea lions were kept for the visitors' entertainment, plus non-stop music, of course. Most notable, however, was the notorious roller coaster, Flip Flap Railway. The Flip Flap Railway was an extraordinary example of low-fare economics and regulation. The poorly designed coaster gave riders whiplash, back pain, and at times, ejection from the cars while in motion. This was because the Flip Flap's looping track was a perfect circle on which the wooden cart was moving at drastically higher speeds than necessary. So the force of gravity was dramatic at the very entrance and exit of the loop. Allow me to elaborate on why this was so dangerous. You see, the average human body can handle 5 times Earth's gravitational pull, with stuntmen and fighter pilots being trained to take a few times more than that. Flip Flap introduced passengers to an estimated 12 times Earth's gravity. This was the first design open to users though, so maybe some understanding is deserved, as they didn't know about G-force and coaster engineering as well as we do now. Boyton left nothing to chance when he chose to open the park on the 4th of July that year. He used his connections as a stuntman to invite newspapers, celebrities, as well as several international and local government leaders. Unfortunately, in a show of irony that probably wasn't lost on anyone, heavy rains that day flooded the water park and West Brighton was turned into an unforgiving mud pit. He tried again on the 5th to virtually identical results. But by that Sunday, the park had fair weather and a proper opening. A couple of weeks later, on Sunday the 21st, a heat wave drove hundreds of thousands to Sea Lion Park to shoot the chutes, as Boyton himself often said. The crowds were so massive that the relatively clean attitude of the area was impressive. There were only 5 arrests in a group measuring over 120,000 people, but that definitely doesn't represent how taxed the local businesses were. Food wasn't cheap for all the visitors. Some restaurants and bars ran out of beer, and the island's trolleys were all broken down for most of the morning. Either way, the owner gave his crowd a show when one woman somehow dropped her wedding ring into the lagoons. He put on his float suit and promptly recovered it and returned it. On top of what I mentioned a moment ago, there was still another revolutionary detail about the park, as Boyton had entirely fenced it in, requiring only a reasonable admission fee for entrance. His other parks had the admission fee as well, but they were far from the scale offered at Coney Island. These parks were the first to combine so many forms of entertainment, and their impact was enormous. Sea Lion Park ultimately wouldn't survive past 1902, when heavy summer rains made mass attendance unreasonable, nor would the impressive Luna Park that covered the old water park's land. It seems the location just wasn't practical enough. However, 2 other much more significant parks would follow. Dreamland and Steeple Chase Parks rose quickly after Sea Lion failed, and both severely outlasted it, but we'll have to focus on Steeple Chaser for brevity, with Steeple Chase being the park that perhaps has the longest lasting legacy. Steeple Chase was opened by George Tillieu, a man who'd been inspired by Boyton's park but wanted to create something more versatile, focusing much more on unique and large-scale roller coasters. Some of the flagship attractions were the Steeple Chase horse racetrack and the Trip to the Moon. The first was an unpowered racetrack where each car was a ride on a horse sliding up and down the track. It was designed so that large groups could compete against each other in fair races, since the 42 separate tracks were each the same length of over 1,000 feet laid side by side. The park also included a giant fake volcano, purely for novelty, and a sizable ocean view promenade building to watch the island and the ocean in peace. Tillieu's park opened to great success in its time, surviving a ravaging fire and the world wars. It also saw the island drastically improve and change. In fact, during its lifetime, Coney Island ceased to be an island. This was because traffic increased on the island, and since the bridges were questionable in heavy rain, the river separating the island was partially filled in, making Coney Island a small peninsula. However, the name Coney Island has stuck in popular media. But what's important here is that Steeple Chase Park was already much more like a common amusement park that you'd see today than Sea Lion or the others ever were. It further revolutionized the concept. While most of the attractions were roller coasters as we see today at large amusement parks, Tillieu built even further by introducing bundle tickets for meals, interest, and special events held at the park. And these innovations really helped it endure longer than its neighboring Dreamland or Luna Park. But despite that endurance, even Steeple Chase wouldn't last forever. Steeple Chase was opened until 1961, making it one of the longest parks to operate on Coney Island. The most well-known park today is Luna Park, formerly named Astroland. This park is loved for its signature attraction, the oldest all-wooden roller coaster in the world, the Cyclone. Still, when it first opened, Astroland was a very different park, focused almost entirely around the space race. It was a tribute to NASA and the stars, and looking back, it is really a relevant feeling to anyone born after the space race. The Cape Canaveral satellite, the Mercury Skyride, Tower to the Stars, and the Neptune diving bells all make the best case. Even so, things were going well at Astroland, but never quite excellent. Amusement parks are complicated businesses. They're constantly battling overhead and debt. On top of this, you can add weather, location, visibility, and sheer bad luck. Astroland, just like its forebears, wasn't any different. The 60s were terrible years for the park, and by 1975, it almost burnt down. But they kept fighting to stay alive, and perhaps they spent too much money doing what they could do to add new attractions rather than holding a reserve fund. And when parks find themselves in trouble without a reserve fund, maintenance is frequently the first thing to go. Accordingly, in 2013, Astroland had a terrible wake-up call. On the 1st of July, 2013, the 275-foot Astro Tower and observation deck was inspected by safety engineers and officials who found it to be rapidly decaying. But this wasn't a new topic. Since 2010, the attraction had been closed because of foundation problems and structural swaying. But in 2013, it was such that inadequate portions of the parks had to be closed to visitors, as there was a chance that the tower could actually collapse on its own. Although it had survived the harsh climate and many storm seasons, including Super Hurricane Sandy, by 2013, time had taken its toll. To make matters worse, the countermeasures they used to protect the tower were actually worsening the swaying. People were saying it was the worst thing they'd ever seen, and that the sound was even more disturbing. It was squeaking, with tourists recalling, quote, "It was like it just wasn't oiled, like parts were rusting." As you can imagine, this ruined the 4th of July holiday, as on the 5th, with little fanfare and less planning, the tower was partly demolished to remove the hazard. But it seemed that the park owners were undeterred, as just 5 years later, they opened the 137-foot Astro Tower gravity drop ride. However, that hasn't gotten much mileage, and you could probably guess why. COVID-19 was perhaps the worst event for the parks on Coney Island since World War II. At least during the wars, the parks could stay open, but the emergence of the coronavirus in 2019 had the same ramifications for Coney Island as most other theme parks. People became afraid to travel, and those who did often found themselves in a difficult situation. There was perhaps one stroke of luck, as Coney Island had already been closed for their periodic fall shutdown and maintenance in 2019 when the virus first emerged. But as things deteriorated, they complied with the state order to remain closed at massive expense. This lasted all fall, then the remaining winter, and before they knew it, they were still closed for the spring and summer of 2020. It wasn't until February of 2021 that they could reopen at only a third of their capacity. The parks were closed for a whopping 525 days, but since have returned to working order. So where does that leave us with Coney Island? Well, Coney Island is New York City in a microcosm. The island has grown and changed significantly since it came on our map. It's been the host to all walks of life and many eras of New York history. From agriculture to a city with insane ownership codes, Coney Island has been entertainment at its finest and worst, but it's always been America's original amusement park. I can't really say the same about New Jersey's Action Park, which was perhaps America's most deadly amusement park. To find out why, click right here. And until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.